Boa tarde a todos. Sou o Marcos Quintela, diretor do Centro de Estudos FGV Transportes. Estou aqui para moderar esse importante webinar intitulado Os Setores de Aviação e Aeroportos, Impactos e Transformações do pós-covid-19. Antes de iniciar, cabe dizer que o público que nos assiste é brasileiro, em sua maioria, mas dois de nossos palestrantes são americanos e não falam português. Farei a apresentação na maior parte do tempo em português, mas às vezes farei algumas colocações em inglês para os nossos convidados se situarem, e as perguntas dirigidas aos palestrantes por nossos debatedores deverão ser em inglês. Cabe comunicar que houve duas substituições de última hora por motivo de força maior. O palestrante Guilherme Xavier, da Oliver Wyman, foi substituído por Khalid Usman, também da Oliver Wyman, e o debatedor Eduardo Sanovic, presidente da ABA, foi substituído por Rui Amparo, também da ABA, e ex-vice-presidente da TAM. Além disso, o Alexandre Monteiro, CEO do Rio Galeão, teve um problema de saúde da família e não poderá participar. Tá? I would like to clarify to our guest panelists, Mr. Richard and Mr. Khalid, that the audience is mostly Brazilian, and my moderation will be in Portuguese, but I will sometimes speak in English so that you can understand what's going on. And the questions addressed to you will be in English. I'm here to moderate this webinar, the aviation and airport sectors, impacts and transformations in the post-COVID-19. Este webinário é organizado pela FGV In Company, liderada pelo professor João Lins e com apoio do professor Márcio Komerauer, também da FGV, em parceria com o FGV Transportes, liderado por mim, Marcos Quintela, juntamente com o Consulado Geral dos Estados Unidos, representado pelo Genar Buriti, pela Fabiana Rios, com a Câmara de Comércio Americano Amcham, representada pelo Pedro Spadali, e com o apoio da Associação Brasileira da Indústria, da Infraestrutura e Indústrias de Base, a Abdib. Inicialmente, gostaria de agradecer à FGV In Company e ao Consulado Geral dos Estados Unidos e à Amcham pelo convite feito a mim para moderar este importante webinário. É motivo de orgulho estar aqui com vocês e eu agradeço novamente. I thank the presence of our three panelists, Mr. Richard Abulafia, Vice President of Analysis at TIL Group, Mr. Khalid Usman, Senior Vice President in Oliver Wyman's Washington, D.C. office, Mr. Espício Espírito Santo, Professor of Air Transportation at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. I also thank the presence of our two debaters, Mr. Rui Amparo, Senior Counsel of the Brazilian Association of Airlines, ABA, and former Vice President for Maintenance and Flight Operation at TAM Airlines. Nowadays, it's called LATAM Airlines. Mr. Genar Buriti, Commercial Specialist of U.S. Department of Commerce, International Trade Administration, U.S. Consulate General. Não posso deixar de agradecer às equipes da FGV e da Amcham, Caroline Ferrol, Raquel Guilhom, Juliana Sanches, Vinícius Santos, Mariane Drain, que deram todo o suporte necessário para a realização deste evento. Agradeço também à diretoria de comunicação e marketing da FGV, a DICOM, e aos nossos parceiros de mídia, a agência Infra, do Jimmy Amora, e a revista Plurali, da Sônia Araripe. As manifestações expressas por integrantes dos quadros da FGV e por convidados que participam dos eventos e transmissões online representam exclusivamente as opiniões dos seus autores e não necessariamente a posição institucional da FGV. Reiteramos também que todos aqui presentes concordaram em participar deste evento de forma espontânea e, com isso, autorizam o uso de sua imagem para esta transmissão, que ficará disponível posteriormente nos canais oficiais da FGV. A dinâmica do webinar será a seguinte: cada palestrante terá 10 minutos para suas considerações iniciais sobre o tema central. Em seguida, abrirei o debate e cada debatedor terá 3 minutos para seus comentários e sua pergunta ao palestrante de sua escolha. O palestrante escolhido terá 2 minutos para responder. Dessa forma, faremos várias rodadas de perguntas até o final do webinar, que será encerrado por volta das 17h15, 17h20. Ok? Right now, I will give the floor to Mr. Richard Abulafia. Welcome and thank you again for your presence. Please, 10 minutes.
Obrigado, Professor Quintela, and thanks to everybody for coming to the webinar. It's an honor to speak to you. I wish I was down in Brazil meeting with you in person, but sadly, this is the sign of the times. And of course, this is exactly what has hit our industry at a very bad moment. I would like for my colleague to share the my presentation with you, please.
Yes.
Obrigado. Okay. So I'm afraid that now that we're 6 months into this crisis, we can see that things are about as bad as we were afraid they would be from 6 months ago. Next page, please. When we were there 6 months ago starting this crisis, my colleagues and I should mention that we look at this industry from a manufacturing standpoint, primarily focusing on aerospace markets. But of course, the biggest single aerospace market is air transport. And unfortunately, as you can see from the top, we decided that probably the most vulnerable segment of our coverage universe would be long-haul international jetliners, basically wide bodies. And sure enough, that is exactly the segment of the market that has proven most vulnerable. International traffic has been hit the hardest of any segment in aviation today. The second manufacturing segment that's been hit, single-aisle jetliners, that too reflects some rather weak domestic markets, and of course also the terrible drop in fuel prices, which make new aircraft a little bit less competitive. Now, third down, and I know this affects aviation in Brazil, because of course Embraer has a strong standing in business jets. We thought it would be somewhat bad. We didn't quite know how bad. And right now we're thinking maybe not that bad. Business jets might be a somewhat protected part of the aviation industry. And then below that, we've got civil rotorcraft, and then finally military programs. The good news is that all aerospace companies, all aviation companies on the manufacturing side have some exposure to defense markets, and defense products are holding up just fine. As a matter of fact, just a couple of days ago, the first Gripen arrived in Brazil. It shows just how strong the military aircraft manufacturing segment is doing, aside from some production disruption. All of the problem right now from an aviation manufacturing standpoint has been on the jetliner side of the industry. Next page, please, Caroline. Thank you. And you can see, of course, this is the heart of the problem. We've never seen numbers like these. This is revenue passenger kilometer demand. That's the blue line. That is the demand for people who want to travel, revenue passenger kilometers. And, you know, you go back and we had some bad times. This chart starts in 2008. 2008 saw some bumpy times, worse than anyone had seen. But now we have this. Look to the right. And here you've got a 63% fall off this year. The worst moment was around 90%. We have never seen anything like this in the history of this business. You can see that the damage to the green line, freight, has not been nearly as bad. Freight is making a comeback. I'm very happy to say that cargo markets look a lot more protected. They might even grow because you've got some unusual requirements, medical equipment, vaccines when they are available, everything like that. Cargo is going to hold up a little bit better. But in terms of people wanting to fly for business or for vacation, it's unbelievably bad. Next page, please. Here on the left, you can see that 63% drop in the context of aviation history. That chart on the left starts with the dawn of the jet age, 1958. And in a really bad year, we'd lose 2%, maybe 3%, but now 63%. This is exceptional, and it reflects, per the top, we have a political commentator in America, Paul Krugman, who said, the world economy is in a medically induced coma, and that's what it is. Hopefully, when we have a vaccine, we'll come out of that coma, but until then, we're in unbelievably bad shape. Our expectation is that we get back to the 2019 peak of air travel demand in around late 2023, early 2024. I'm very hopeful. I think we're going to have one of the fastest recoveries ever, but it's dependent upon a vaccine and people feeling good about flying again. Now, the chart on the right shows the amount of the fleet, the world aviation fleet, that has parked. And again, you typically 10 or 11% is parked. In a bad year, 12 or 13% is parked. But as you can see, we reached a peak of about 65% parked. The good news is only 1/3 is parked now. But the bad news, of course, is that's a lot of planes that aren't flying. So these are very difficult times. Next page, please. The emerging markets, though, have, especially China, this is a chart that shows deliveries to the 4 major emerging markets, your country, Brazil, plus Russia, India, and China. A lot of demand has been driven by China, and China had been experiencing a bit of an aviation downturn even before the COVID-19 pandemic. So we're hoping that when the world comes back, China comes back too. Brazil, of course, also, there'd been a slightly down 2019. So we're also hoping for a solid recovery after there's a vaccine, after the pandemic ceases to be a major issue. Next page, please. Needless to say, as you might expect, jetliner orders have fallen into negative territory. Book-to-bill is no longer a thing in the aviation business. If we're really lucky, we'll have 800 net negative orders this year. That's something we haven't seen before. This is going to be very painful for the industry. Next page, please. Here's what we're expecting in terms of deliveries. At the bottom, the blue line, regionals, I'm afraid they're taking a bit of a hit, but not much of a hit because it's a relatively small part of the industry. Single aisle jetliners, that's the red line. They're going to come back fastest because they were already in something of an undersupply situation coming into this, and because Boeing 737 MAX is hopefully going to restart production in the coming months. However, like I said at the start, international long-haul traffic has been hit very hard. We've got a very serious overcapacity situation with international long-haul jets, and therefore that green line, that takes a long time to come back. That's going to be the part of the industry that's hit hardest and longest by this crisis. Next page, please. This chart shows what we're expecting this year. And every single segment in our coverage universe, whether it's single aisle jetliners at the top or twin aisle jetliners, everything is in negative territory. It's going to be a very bad year for aviation manufacturing. 2021 is only going to be better because of the 737 MAX. When you go from nothing to something, you get some kind of growth. So even though next year we think aviation will grow by 13%, if it weren't for those MAXs coming back, we would still be falling. 2021 and 2022, for most manufacturers, for most people in the aviation business, are going to be very difficult years. We are not expecting a recovery until late 2023 and a full recovery in 2024, 2025. This is going to be the worst crisis faced by the aviation manufacturing sector in the 33 years that I've been working in this business. And I think since World War II, it's just that serious, I'm afraid. Finally, last page there, please, Caroline. Thanks very much. I thought I'd touch upon, of course, Brazil is one of the great aviation producers of the world, courtesy of Embraer, as well as smaller companies like Helibras and others. And here's what we've got, product by product for Embraer. Embraer isn't quite facing the same very difficult times that Airbus and Boeing are facing, because even though Embraer's commercial jetliners are getting hit, it still has the business jet side that's doing pretty well. And as I mentioned at the start, military aviation is holding up just fine. So KC-390, Gripen, those are both in reasonably good shape and hopefully going to keep the worst of it from hitting Brazil's national aviation champion. And with that, Professor Quintela, I will turn over back to you.
Welcome and thank you again. Please, 10 minutes. Okay.
Yep.
Okay.
Can I start?
Okay.
Hello, everyone. I hope everyone is doing great and keeping safe. So we heard a very good presentation with very interesting facts from Richard. I just want to make sure everybody is able to see my screen. Okay, good. So over the next 10 minutes, I will go over some of the aviation demand recovery perspectives. And generally, my background is that we work a lot with aviation entities, including airlines and airports, and how the demand recovery is actually happening. As part of Oliver Wyman, we have also partnered with International Air Transport Association into predicting how the demand recovery is going to be working for the next couple of years, and actually looking at how some of the recovery trends are emerging as well. And that's what I've focused my talk over the next 10 minutes. So again, I think no surprise over here. We saw it in the last 10 minutes as well. If we look at the nature of demand shock that the industry is experiencing, this is unprecedented in nature. Any of the past industry shocks, whether that was global financial crisis or the demand loss post 9/11, these pale in comparison to how deep and how long of a demand shock and the structural shift in industry that we are seeing. If we look at for year 2020, it is expected that the airline capacity will still be down by over 40% or more, and this includes the first 2 to 3 months that we're operating at regular capacity. Now, if you go to the next slide, and I'll show over here that overall, on a global basis, in September 2020, the global capacity is down 61% from 2019. If you look at a regional level, generally similar kind of a trend. Latin America is down at negative 56%, North America at negative 62%, Europe at negative 63%, and Asia, led by the recovery in China, is down at negative 50%. A couple of months ago, and actually these statistics were even down more. In April, we were looking at the capacity down at negative 76%. Brazil, although, is a similar story as well. Currently, Brazil is down by 63% overall. And actually, it's down more on the international side, as Richard has mentioned as well. The international demand is actually taking a much bigger hit. Now, this is a graph which is actually telling us over the last 16 to 18 months, how the demand and how the capacity has tanked down. So literally, once we look at the peak of the crisis in April 2020, the reduction in capacity and a similar reduction in demand, this was roughly over 90%. And now after that, it has started coming back up, but there's not really a significant uptrend that we have seen so far. And that's a global trend that we are seeing across a lot of countries, that the traffic is tending to be picking up in the domestic markets and the international markets are slow to respond. A lot of that is driven by the border closure and the government restrictions as well. Now, within Brazil, actually some of the essential services on the domestic market were being maintained, and that is also, why some of the domestic market is picking up as well. Now, the next chart is also Brazil specific, and I think this is talking about what was the number of passengers trend in 2019 versus 2020, and also what was the average load factor. Load factor is a metric which basically tells us how full the flights are. So again, the demand story is not different than what we saw on the previous page. It's down by 96%. And the load factors roughly were above 82, 83% average on 2019. They have been down at 50% or roughly within that range. And recently it has started getting up. Now, just for context, a typical break-even load factor for an airline, and a break-even load factor, it means what is the load factor or how much do I need to fill my plane before I start making money, could be roughly somewhere in the low 70s to mid 70 range. So that gives us the situation over here that naturally it's very hard for airlines to make money in this kind of a demand environment. Now with that one, I'll start moving to, when does the demand come back? What are the factors which are driving the demand recovery? And we have done a lot of modeling in this area. I'll briefly summarize that there's 4 primary factors which we are looking at, which are basically driving the demand recovery. The first one is the epidemiological timeline, which basically means that how the virus and the propagation of the case counts is actually happening over the countries, because then that actually dictates how the travel sentiment is going to work, because increase in COVID cases means that that significantly depresses travel demand, as well as that imposes more restriction on quarantine and the border closures and all those kind of things. And then the third one is government restrictions, because naturally, domestic travel doesn't get impacted by a lot of government restrictions, although early on we did see all the lockdowns, as even in countries like China, where there's a lot of quarantine restrictions, even put in provinces at the provincial level as well. The final one is the macroeconomic impact. So as the travel starts getting back, it has gone through a GDP shock, and the typical econometric factors, which means that, if my GDP actually goes down, the propensity to travel is going to decrease, and the number of travelers who are going to be up in the air are going to be less as well, which on a long-term basis determines when the travel is going to get back to normal. And on this slide, I'm basically giving some trends of how some of the early impacted countries are recovering, driven by domestic travel. So if we look at some of the case studies over here, China is a prime example, because this was one of the countries which is at the forefront of how the travel recovery is happening, more so on the domestic side rather than the international. So giving some of the recent statistics, although it did take a long time, now the China domestic travel is back to roughly negative 10% on a year-over-year basis. But the international is still down by negative 80 to negative 90%. And part of that is driven by the border closure and the quarantine restrictions that the Chinese government is putting in place as well. If you look at some of the other countries like South Korea and Italy, who are at the forefront of the epidemiological timelines as well, we are also seeing a resurgence of second wave outbreaks that are happening in countries. A lot of the countries within Europe, such as Italy, Spain, are going through a second wave where the travel is getting depressed again after going up, at least on the domestic side. The international travel still remains to be low. And that actually builds or leads to the fact that, the pathway to recovery is going to be bumpy till we see some solid evidence of the vaccination coming and being mass produced and getting distributed and so on and so forth. The next slide gives a similar kind of a trend over how the recovery is happening in US. And with the US, we can see on the domestic market, it's one of the largest aviation markets. We have seen signs of recovery driven by leisure travel, not so much by business. You can see that some of the holiday travel, which happened around the 4th of July, the Labor Day, there were spikes in travel. But at the same time, we haven't seen a sustained recovery. The travel is still down significantly to the tune of like 66%. Similar story around in Canada, although much less severe from an epidemiological perspective. Now, the final slide to summarize, how do we look at the recovery from a long-term scenario outcome perspective? And here we have given basically 3 different scenarios. And our view is that the baseline, which is in the blue line, is the recovery trend that we expect on a global basis. That's where we expect it to land, which is roughly close to end of 2023, like Q3 of 2023, we are saying that the industry revenue and demand is going to start getting it back to the 2019 levels, whereas in a prolonged case, that could actually get to 2024 as well. So that depends on some of the vaccination timelines, how that is going to be panned out. The accelerated recovery scenario is likely a scenario which is going to be over-optimistic and not likely going to happen. That's in a rare case that a vaccination got found very early, and you have mass rollout of the vaccination in a very efficient timeline. That's likely not a consensus estimate. The baseline is what we are gearing our views on, which is a late 2023 recovery, recovering back to 2019 levels. And even then, in the short term, we are expecting that the demand recovery is going to be fairly lumpy. We expect that by 2020, end of 2020, the global demand is only going to be 30% of what it was at 2019 levels. So with that, I'll end my presentation and happy at a later point to entertain questions as well. Back to you, Professor.
Well, I believe that we're missing Professor Quintela, so I'm gonna take over here just to support Quintela before he gets back into the webinar. With that said, Professor Respice, é com grande prazer que eu lhe convido para fazer a sua apresentação. Prazer revê-lo. O Respice sempre foi um grande parceiro do Americano, já fez alguns webinars juntos ao nosso escritório. Novamente, então, prazer revê-lo. E passo, então, a palavra ao senhor.
Muito obrigado, Janar. Dear Khalid and Richard, I'm going to make my presentation in Portuguese, for the audience is basically Brazilian, and I will try to remake the questions when we debate with all of us, okay, in English, okay, but the presentation will be in Portuguese, okay, Richard and Khalid. Agradeço muito, Janar, agradeço ao Quintela, à FGV, pela oportunidade de participar aqui do webinar. Eu preparei um pequeno texto, um tanto quanto provocativo, olhando alguns pontos na tentativa de fazermos um exercício de cenários, né? Eu gosto de trabalhar muito com cenários, eu trabalhei com cenários durante muitos anos, voltados à aviação, e eu, inclusive, falei com o Quintela que faria uma apresentação um pouco provocativa e baseada em algumas perguntas. O Quintela já está de volta aí conosco.
Desculpa aí, mas... Tá bom, vamos lá.
Nada, tranquilo, que isso, Quintela. Estava agradecendo a você, a FGV, ao Genar e a todos aqui na audiência, os nossos convidados aqui pela oportunidade e pelo convite aqui para eu participar aqui do webinar. Então, a fala que eu farei agora, ela não está focada no Brasil, está focada no mundo, como os nossos amigos Richard e Khalid fizeram. Tá? Então, dentro da provocação, vamos lá. Eu preparei um texto, eu vou lendo esse texto aqui, depois, se quiserem, eu até disponibilizo, passo para o Quintela aqui na FGV para colocar como um link aqui no YouTube depois. Tá? Então, o transporte aéreo mundial passou por várias crises. Esse é um dos setores mais afetados por crises quando nós as temos, né, dentro da área local, dentro da área regional e mundial. Né? Lastimavelmente, estamos num setor que é, de forma contundente, né, atingido por essas crises. Contudo, essas crises que passaram, né, não a atual, mas as anteriores, foram de caráter regional e, quando foram mundiais, como algumas ocorreram já na parte de saúde, né, com HN1, SARS-1, e aí vai, foram de caráter temporário, foram de caráter mundial, foram de caráter global, mas foram de caráter temporário, né, quando falamos de passageiros e de cargas sendo transportados via aéreo. Então, se nós pudéssemos colocar a crise mais contundente nos anos pós-deregulation, né, pós-1978 nos Estados Unidos e no mundo inteiro, em especial crise com relação às incertezas, né, porque as incertezas é que são temáticas, né? Que nós temos de hard evidence, né, quer dizer, tecnologia, uma recuperação até um certo ponto, modelos de previsão, todos são recheados de incertezas do quando, do como, o tamanho do prejuízo financeiro também, né, além das incertezas. Talvez só nós tenhamos tido assim a ideia de uma crise desse nível no 11 de setembro, né? No pós-11 de setembro, nós tínhamos o que vai acontecer com o mundo agora? Como os aeroportos vão se adaptar? Como as empresas aéreas vão se adaptar? Será que os passageiros retornam rápido? Será que não retornam? Até mesmo o tráfego doméstico, não apenas nos Estados Unidos e no Canadá, mas em todos os países do globo foram afetados de uma forma aqui, outra forma ali. E tivemos outras crises também, né? Mas a de 11 de setembro foi realmente a mais contundente para a aviação, nesse sentido que eu estou levantando aqui, no sentido das incertezas e no sentido do prejuízo financeiro, né? Só que a atual crise decorrente do Covid-19, ela é muito mais ampla, né? Ela é muito mais impactante, ela é muito mais profunda na questão de seriedade e também no volume das incertezas, né? Na minha opinião, existem muito mais incertezas agora do que na época do 11 de setembro. Eu não fiz as contas, mas eu acredito que se nós somarmos os prejuízos financeiros das empresas aéreas, dos aeroportos, dos fabricantes de aeronaves, de todas essas crises anteriores, né, tendo o marco de 1978 da deregulation americana como o início, talvez se nós somarmos todos os prejuízos dessas crises anteriores, nós talvez não consigamos chegar ao prejuízo que está acontecendo agora, né, devido ao Covid-19 na aviação mundial. Então, mas só que essa crise atual, ela também tem outras implicações. Ela tem implicações psicológicas, emocionais, educacionais, culturais, sociais, né? Ou até mesmo o termo distanciamento social é um tanto quanto, vamos dizer assim, contundente, né? Nós precisamos nos distanciar uns aos outros para buscar um menor contágio. Então, tudo isso influencia diretamente o nosso dia a dia como seres humanos. Isso influencia diretamente o nosso dia a dia como seres humanos, influencia o nosso comportamento, influencia também as nossas necessidades, as nossas vontades de deslocamento, principalmente via aérea. Então, o que nós precisamos fazer? Na minha opinião, nós precisamos não apenas pensar fora da caixa, mas literalmente pensar como se a caixa não existisse. Não existisse caixa nenhuma para a gente se colocar, para a gente se limitar. Então, pensar completamente diferente do que nós já fizemos até agora. Por quê? Porque essa é uma crise completamente diferente. Os gráficos do Richard e do Khalid mostraram isso, né? Que a recuperação, na minha opinião, vai ser muito lenta, como eles também colocaram. E, na minha visão, não haverá uma recuperação total aos níveis de 2019, em especial para aquele público que dá mais recursos, dá mais receitas e lucro para as empresas aéreas e para os aeroportos, que é o tráfego executivo, que é o tráfego voando a negócios, que é o tráfego de eventos, feiras e congressos. Esses dois segmentos do turismo, o turismo de negócios e o turismo de feiras, eventos e congressos, na minha opinião, terá uma queda, assim, não temporária, mas permanente da demanda. Permanente da demanda. Um parênteses no meio do caminho, e eu vou falar por que esse parênteses daqui a pouco, porque vai ter uma pergunta em cima dele. Não sei se os senhores conhecem, mas como eu sou um fã da técnica de elaboração de cenário Global Business Network, que tem os executivos vindo lá da Royal Dutch Shell, da década de 60, de 70 e outros mais, em 2010, há exatos 10 anos atrás, foi publicado o trabalho Scenarios for the Future of Technology in International Development, pela Global Business Network e em parceria com a Rockefeller Foundation. Um dos cenários se não me engano, o cenário 4, era um cenário de pandemia. E se vocês observarem esse documento, lerem o que foi escrito em 2010, é como se tivesse sido escrito por um vidente, porque é exatamente o que está acontecendo, exatamente, sem tirar nem pôr. Tá? Então, a minha primeira pergunta é exatamente voltado para esse estudo da Global Business Network. Então, levantando uma pergunta aqui. Por que nem a IATA, nem a ICAO, nem a ACI, nem qualquer entidade pública e privada ligada ao setor de aviação internacional, quer pública ou privada, né, deu qualquer importância a esse estudo? O estudo está na internet desde 2010, quando ele foi publicado. Ninguém levou em consideração cenários sendo elaborados por um dos think tanks mundiais mais famosos nesse setor, que é a Global Business Network. Onde estava a IATA, onde estava a ACI, onde estava todo mundo que não observou esses estudos, né? Simplesmente deixaram passar, né? Isso nunca vai acontecer. Bem, pois é, eles falavam a mesma coisa na década de 60, início dos anos 70, quando esses mesmos estrategistas trabalhando na Royal Dutch Shell falaram que o choque do petróleo estava perto, que a mesa do petróleo ia virar, e virou. Tá? Ninguém acreditava, mas virou. Então, eles também já fizeram outros cenários que se materializaram. O timing dos cenários, na verdade, não é a parte mais importante, mas sim o cenário em si. Então, onde estava a aviação mundial, representadas pelas suas principais entidades, Airports Council International, a IATA, a própria Council, e a ICAO, né? Onde estava tudo isso? Onde estavam todas essas entidades que não prestaram atenção numa empresa renomada mundialmente, com especialistas, com cenaristas renomados mundialmente, falando a respeito de um cenário de pandemia, né? Onde estavam? Né? Um outro ponto é o que nós estamos pensando com relação a provocar o pensamento do futuro, né? Não o quando vai acontecer a retomada, se vai ser uma curva em V, se vai ser uma curva em U, se nós vamos ter a retomada a partir de meados de 2013, de 2023 para 2024, mas nós precisamos para frente. E nessa gama de incertezas, nós precisamos planejar com base nas incertezas. E dentro dessas incertezas, eu coloquei uma outra pergunta aqui, que é com base na não recuperação da demanda. Tá? Novamente, não estou me prendendo se a recuperação será em V, se será em U, se acontecerá em 2023, se acontecerá em 2024. A consideração é a seguinte: o que as empresas aéreas e os aeroportos, no Brasil e no mundo, farão caso a redução da demanda seja na casa de 20% a 25%? Permanente redução. Não haja recuperação desses 20% ou 25% de demanda. E que a grande parte desses 20% ou 25% de demanda esteja em cima desse público, desse segmento de viagens a negócios e viagens a feiras, eventos e congressos. O que nós faremos? Não, isso é impossível de acontecer. Todas as nossas previsões estão apontando que, no máximo, no final de 2024, nós teremos de volta a demanda de 2019. Ok, senhores, mas, novamente, ninguém prestou atenção quando o cenário de pandemia foi escrito em 2010. Ninguém deu atenção, ninguém deu importância. Por favor, vamos dar importância a algumas considerações um tanto quanto difíceis para a indústria. E se, what if, e se a demanda não se recuperar aos níveis de 2019? As empresas aéreas e os aeroportos fazem o quê? Principalmente se essa demanda que não será recuperada estiver, na sua maior parte, no tráfego a negócios, no tráfego executivo, que tanto dá de receitas e lucros para as empresas aéreas e para os aeroportos. Tá? O que nós estamos fazendo aqui agora, um evento online, nós já fizemos tantos outros eventos online, nós estamos ministrando, nós temos reuniões online, e parecer chato, esses eventos online, eu considero extremamente impessoais. Eu adoraria estar de presente com todos aí, inclusive com a audiência, claro, muitos conhecidos, muitos amigos, mas no momento isso é impossível. Esses nossos encontros online estão provando por A mais B que uma parte das reuniões, dependendo do tipo da reunião, da duração da reunião, da agenda da reunião, mesmo para os eventos, eles podem sim ser substituídos de forma eficaz por encontros online. Então, também nós estamos desmistificando a famosa teleconferência, que sempre foi colocada em xeque e sempre falaram, de forma nenhuma, não vai substituir as viagens. As viagens estão garantidas, principalmente as de negócio. Bem, nós estamos provando por A mais B que, apesar de impessoais, apesar de, às vezes, chatas, se forem muito longas as reuniões online, elas sim podem substituir de forma eficaz o encontro face a face. Então, repetindo, se houver uma perda irreversível de demanda, o que empresas aéreas e aeroportos farão? Né? Como reconceber, reinventar os modelos de negócio vigentes para uma queda de demanda, se esta acontecer de forma definitiva, não temporária, mas definitiva? Por último, eu gostaria de levantar a respeito do nosso seres humanos. Nós temos visto, né, essa pandemia acendeu uma teia de radicalismos entre indivíduos e grupos com opiniões diferentes. Não estamos falando da eleição do presidente brasileiro, nós não estamos falando com a eleição nos Estados Unidos agora, nós estamos falando de usar máscara ou não, eu vou tomar vacina ou não, eu não vou me distanciar, eu me recuso a comprar o produto originário do país tal. Então, tudo isso aflorou de uma forma assim muito, muito, muito pronunciada pela pandemia do Covid-19. E tão cedo nós não vamos nos ver livres desses radicalismos. Então, isso interfere diretamente a nossa relação como pessoas, como seres humanos. Então, a pergunta é o seguinte, com base nisso, o que empresas aéreas e aeroportos como elas podem repensar a parte de treinamento do seu quadro de profissionais, até mesmo recrutamento de novos profissionais, para, primeiro, identificar e quantificar essas tensões entre indivíduos e grupos, esse radicalismo entre indivíduos e grupos, principalmente porque nós sabemos que existem várias empresas aéreas no mundo que operam com tripulações multinacionais. Isso afeta o safety ou não afeta o safety? Com relação a viagens de longo curso, o clima, no sentido animosidade a bordo, passageiro com passageiro, passageiro com comissário, comissário com passageiro e por aí vai. Tudo em cima desse radicalismo aflorado que nós temos visto pelo Covid-19, pela pandemia, por todos os problemas que nós estamos passando. Né? Uma viagem de curta duração, você tem como gerenciar da melhor forma possível, né? Colocar panos quentes, como nós falamos aqui no Brasil. Mas uma viagem de 12, 13, 14 horas? O que nós faremos na imigração dos nossos aeroportos? No mundo inteiro, não estou falando só no Brasil, no mundo inteiro. Pessoas com animosidade com relação às outras, com medo com relação às outras. E a vacina. Não vamos colocar a vacina no meio do caminho agora, tá? Vamos colocar o comportamento humano, até mesmo porque você não sabe se a outra pessoa tomou a vacina ou não. Né? Com relação aos aeroportos, novamente, boicotes temporários a determinados produtos de algumas nacionalidades no seu duty free. Como é que eles farão para recuperar essa receita? Então, eu agradeço mais uma vez. Foi bem provocativo a minha ideia aqui de lançar essas perguntas. E obrigado mais uma vez, Quintela, Genar e a todos na FGV.
Tá, nós vamos voltar já. Eu vou pedir ao Rui Rui Amparo. Grande honra tê-lo aqui conosco. Obrigado aí pela disponibilidade. Faça seus comentários, por favor, e faça uma pergunta para quem você achar mais conveniente. Vamos começar o debate. Let's open the debate now, okay, Mr. Richard and Mr. Collin.
Okay, first of all...
I have two questions from audience in English, okay? After Mr. Rui, I will pass, okay?
Okay, first of all, congratulations to the three speakers. It was quite interesting, quite different visions, some more mathematical. Just to place a comment on the Brazilian air traffic, we are reaching now in October on the domestic trade, we are reaching 51% of the departures that we have in a pre-pandemic situation. So I'm adding to Mr. Usman some extra data. It's on the last information on the ANAC site now that we follow every day. This is the kind of crisis that there are no manuals for. So we are learning to deal with the crisis. In most of the cases, some government agencies around the world, we are using much more our instinct and our experience of previous crises than exactly to pick up a manual on the shelf and just say, oh, this is the checklist. What about can we do? And so I have three quick questions. The first of all is to Professor Respicio, because it's in line of all the provocations that he has made. And I'll follow in English because I would like to hear also the comments of the other speakers, if possible. So, furthermore, to managing the crisis in the current situation, so we need to survive. We airlines, we airports, so we need to try to reach a minimum level of survivability. In some cases, taking money to have some breath during this time that we need to pay after. So it's a very really difficult situation. But the damages, further to all that Professor Respicio has talked about the problems and the possibility of we don't have the traffic coming back in the current levels, never more, at least on the mind of the people of business, and it's a possibility, you know. I'm seeing another problem is that a kind of a second wave of problems that currently we are diverting, and we are in an education environment, so that's why I consider this question important. So we are diverting a lot of young people from the technological areas, from aviation, for instance. And so you have a lot of people unemployed that on the steps of the recovery, aviation will hire this airport, we will hire these people again. And it will take time. Meanwhile, a lot of young people are not being stimulated to start in the colleges to study, to go for this area. It means that we may face in, I don't know, around 8 years, 10 years, a kind of, as incredible as it may seem, a shortage that will damage the long-term recovery on aviation. So I would ask, I think it's mainly to Professor Respicio, your comments on that, because I think it add on your comments. And if you allow me to Mr. Abulafia, also, if you may place some comments on the use of low cost per trip aircraft like turboprops on the recovery, you know, because it's clear that today you have, due to all the circumstances, you need to have cheaper, low cost airplanes in order to all the routes. So if you may place some comment on that, I would thank you. That's my vision. Thanks.
Professor Respicio, would you like?
Genar, por favor, faça seus comentários se tiver alguma pergunta. Eu já tenho aqui duas preparadas e também depois vamos voltar aqui para o Rui e para o para o público presente, tá bom?
No, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Richard, Khalid, and Respicio for your comments, and very interesting, very challenging at the same time. We have been following up the recent events, related to the COVID and the impact on the aviation industry as well in the airport segment. And I'm going to start with the airports because Brazil has been, for over the past 10 years, concessioning, most of the airports, which I believe one of the most successful infrastructure concessions from the Brazilian government. We were able to concession most of the main Brazilian hubs. Of course, there were some adjustments that need to be made, and I think that the Brazilian Civil Aviation Secretariat has the capability, to make those adjustments. But over the past 10 years, when we think about airport concessions, the trend was to develop airports in which, you would create some sort of an experience the traveler, with the implementation of shopping centers, with restaurants, inviting, the traveler to spend more time at the airports. And I keep wondering if that aviation rebound is going to take that long. What's going to be the impact, financially for those airports survive? As Professor was saying, let's consider that eventually we're not going to have a completely rebound of the number of users. Let's imagine that in 4 or 5 years we're still going to be missing 225% of the traveling team. So this is one of the reports financially, which is related to the. If I'm not mistaken, in the United States we use the number that importance of the aviation industry on the American GDP, and please, $1 trillion, the impact of the aviation industry. That would include not just port, hotel industry, and airline companies. So, what we have been facing, it's probably, a huge challenge for the recovery of the United States GDP. And finally, going maybe following what Mr. Rui Amparo just said, considering that some of those airports will be more challenged, to survive throughout those years, should we see eventually, some of the larger airports having a better chance to survive throughout those years, and as a result of those airports becoming more important hubs, see a chance of regional aircraft manufacturers, benefiting, at least over the next years of this potential impact airport and aviation industry. I think that those are my.
Tá cortando muito a sua internet.
I'm not sure if Richard Ned you see this relation. Thank you.
Tá cortando muito.
Mas deu para ouvir a pergunta?
Eu não ouvi essa última pergunta. Você fez a pergunta para o Richard? Foi isso?
No, I made the question to, one of the questions I made to Khalid, which was his vision in terms of the impact, not just of the, was the impact of the airport financial sustainability over the next years, given this downturn in terms of the aviation industry.
Yep, no, happy to give my comments on that one. And actually, as we are seeing the demand shock, which is unprecedented in nature, it's the whole aviation ecosystem that is getting affected pretty severely. Naturally, it comes down to airlines, it comes down to airports. And where size was an advantage in the past, right now, it's a double-edged sword in the sense that, the bigger you are, the bigger your cash burn is going to be, because what has literally happened, and I think as we are looking at the virus propagation to the countries, and there's going to be cases where the second waves are going to be hit as well, and the aviation does come to taking a massive, downturn on the passenger traffic. So even there, I think, there's going to be pockets of companies or airports or airlines which have less exposure to international traffic. I think from an international traffic standpoint, we see that is going to be coming much later. So even airports which are catering more to domestic traffic, airlines which are more so primarily LCC, not legacy, because not just with this demand shock, even with the past demand shocks, once we look at history over the past 20 years, even incidents which are much smaller than this one, whenever there's a demand shock happening, people tend to get more price sensitive as well. Even right now, as we are looking at the recovery around the world, just giving you some statistics from China domestic, which has a lot of recovery right now, which is at negative 10% year over year. Most of that demand is actually coming from leisure travel. And the business of the corporate travel is still down by over 50%. And that mix of passengers is going to be changing. But it has a widespread implication on the whole aviation ecosystem, including the airports as well as airlines. And actually, as you mentioned, on the airport side, the non-aeronautical revenue, which is people spending their time on the airports, using the restaurants, using the facilities and concessions, that's a big revenue stream, which in any modernized airport system needs to have a revenue dependence, which is roughly 50%. And now with everything that is happening, which is going to continue for some time, from a longer term perspective, though, once we look at aviation industry as a whole, aviation industry has been resilient. It has, gone through past shocks which people thought it will never recover. Now, this one is more unprecedented in nature. Aviation overall is one of the very critical parts of the whole economic system. And, the governments, from that sense, cannot let it fail. So to the extent that, how the airlines and airports have to start getting creative in cost-cutting measures, and what I would say is variabilizing my costs. Because for any of these companies, if you have a big component of fixed costs, that means that even if I have traffic, I'm going to be burning a lot of cash burn. And as the industry is going through downturn, the effect of how do I become innovative and restructure my, my business to actually adapt to an environment where I can sustain this downturn and come out as a stronger entity. I think that's going to be the key to survival for airports as well as airlines. Variabilizing the cost for airlines, where it comes down to, naturally, as Richard was mentioning, the aircraft market is going to be taking a hit as well. The values go down, the leasing rates cut down. So how can I structure my leases around that? How can I have some honeymoon or lease period which I can negotiate with my lessors, which means I'm not going to be paying you right now. I could actually pay you at the back end, or some of those creative financial instruments that you can use to minimize your cash burn for a period which is going to last for the next 8 to 12 to 16 months, where the demand is going to be depressed. And the key to actually survive through that one, and then be a resilient entity at the once the recovery starts happening.
Okay. Mr. Rui Amparo, you have some question for Mr. Richard?
Yes, it was a comment on what we have said, but just, I would like to add, if you allow me, to Khalid comments. So and again, coming back to Mr. Respicio, some companies, how do we adapt to a downturn, a permanent downturn in traffic? I would like then Richard to comment on that, okay? But I think the initial answer is some companies, some airlines will die. So it means that you have, on the next years, in our vision, a strong consolidation of the sector that, by the way, is something that is in fact that was already happening in the aviation, the world of aviation, because of the low margins that we were facing before pandemic, and historically, some airlines will die, like Panam, like TWA, like Varig in Brazil. So unfortunately, the ecosystem of aviation is absolutely unpredictable. I would like to hear some comments of Richard on that, please.
Yeah, I guess, first of all, I am, of course, very concerned about what's going to happen next in this industry. When you have a profound traffic downturn like this, bad things are going to happen, like you say. However, I tend to think that things will come back. And, I like Kali's timeline. Best case scenario, 8 months, base case, 12 months, worst case, 16 months, before you start to see some kind of recovery that make things a little bit better. Until then, it's going to be absolutely awful. And I have a couple of thoughts. So much of the growth we've seen in this business over the past decade has been airlines that are truly global. They're not domiciled anywhere. They're not, Mr. Amparo, you just mentioned a bunch of traditional flag carriers that had gone bust, from Pan Am to Varig. And all the growth has been in Air Asia or Norwegian, these airlines that are truly without a home. They're meant to be global carriers. Yet that also means they might not get the government support that a national champion would get. Will they be more vulnerable? Because they tend to be high density seating, will they be vulnerable to capacity restrictions meant to prevent the COVID-19 virus from spreading? Will there be a whole host of things that make these carriers the most vulnerable of all? And I hope not. Certainly, some of them are reasonably well placed, and they've been such a big part of growth for the industry for the past decade or so that I think we have to be very mindful of that. I can't think of a way realistically for the system to support these international carriers the way we could support a truly national carrier, but it's something that I think we have to watch as an industry.
Okay, I have a question from the audience, Mr.
Quintela, let me answer the question from Rui. He said about new professionals. Okay. Rui, I think this huge crisis is also a huge opportunity, not only for all of us to rethink some concepts, some theories. One of them is the airline business model. I am sure this is a monumental opportunity for a great and deep revision, reconcept of the airline business model. It's a huge opportunity. And also an opportunity, not in the short term, but in the medium and long term, for these new professionals, for these enthusiasts in aviation to come and help or even lead this transformation to a new era of airline business models, a new era of electric aircraft, a new era of flying wings, or a new era of airport business models. I think this is a huge opportunity, and we will have these groups of young people that are with their 15 years old now, 20-year-old now, that in 10 years will be reshaping, helping or leading the reshape of several concepts, theories, and practices of the airline and the airport industry. This is my view on your question. About you said about consolidation, I agree fully. Consolidation is a plague in the airline industry. I personally hate consolidation. I love competition, and competition only comes when you are able to have a new business model, for you to question the paradigms and make it a new vision, like Southwest did with a concept that already had been working in the 60s. How other airlines were able to increment some new business models or parts of business models. I am sure we are having this opportunity, and we must take this opportunity for ourselves.
Okay. I have a question from Andrea Salgado. Mr. Collin, considering the future scenario, how do you see the entrance of new airlines in this pandemic moment? Is it an advantage or a bigger challenge?
No, I think that's a great question. And, I think with some of the theme as, yes, this is the biggest turmoil, there could be some pockets of opportunity as well. I mean, I think if you think from a conceptual standpoint, if somebody has the means to start an airline, this might be the best time to actually start it, because all what you want to do is you can get the aircraft assets, you can get the labor pool and everything, and you can really start the setting of the shoot at a very good pace. If you recall some of the past incidents, like after some of the downturn in aviation industry back in 2003 and 2004, that's where actually Emirates Airlines placed their largest ever aircraft order. So there could be some pockets of opportunities over there, but I think it does become challenging for the perspective that it's a risky proposition for a startup airline to actually say, well, I'm going to be doing this kind of investment, and I'm going to be betting on a recovery where the timelines are fairly uncertain. So overall, from that perspective, I do not foresee that there's going to be a lot of startup activity that is going to be happening in the markets, even though I think from a cost perspective, if you think this is the time where you can actually get all the assets at a very distressed level and those kind of things. And there might be some opportunistic play that will come in by entities or by governments or people who would have the deep pockets or to sustain and ride through this downturn for the next 8 to 12 months and come at the back end where they can actually launch something. But those are going to be very small, actually, happening very small. So it's not going to be something that we'll see that the startups are going to come there. I would generally agree with the theme that, naturally we will see consolidation of weaker players. And that has, if we use the US industry as a test case for that, there was some discussion around that. Back in starting from 2001 till 2010, there were 10 major carriers which merged into 4 major players. That was part of it because it went through like 2 major financial crises and the demand shocks that happened as well. It's a natural outcome of that one, and we will likely see that happening in parts of the world as well. Less so on the startup activity. I still see on the opportunistic side there could be some activity that happens, but on a fairly minimal basis.
Ok, Jana, thank you. Jana, teria alguma pergunta?
Sure, I have one for Richard. Richard, I have been wondering, how challenging, it has been for aircraft manufacturers but also, surrounding those manufacturers, we have a group of port suppliers, that are direct connected to companies like Boeing and company like Airbus or, Embraer. And now what concerns me the most is how those companies, are gonna be able to survive throughout such a long process, and what could be the impact, for the major aircraft manufacturers, to lose some of those suppliers.
Yeah, that's the biggest single issue that we face in my part of the coverage universe. Obviously 75% of the value of the aircraft industry comes from these suppliers, and it's a truly global business. There isn't a country in the world that doesn't have a supplier impacted by this. And the general feeling is that maybe 20% of the names in the supply chain, the global supply chain, are at risk in some way or another. So, a couple things to think about. One is company by company, those with the most military exposure, no matter where they are, they're in the best shape. But there are some companies that are 90% commercial, and that's very difficult. The next is, of course, there have been huge consolidation moves in the supply chain over the past years, resulting in the creation of Raytheon Technologies, the modern General Electric, the modern Safran, the modern Honeywell, the really big ones. They'll be fine. They have the access to capital. They have the diversified portfolios. But what do you do with the smaller companies in the third and fourth tier that have heavy commercial exposure? And the only answer there, I'm afraid, is either government aid or aid by their customers, a willingness to step in and say, we cannot afford to see our supply chain jeopardized. We must give you advance payments or whatever else. And for the big players, that's yet another obligation in a time of extreme difficulty.
Okay. It's okay, Shana?
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I have
Yes, thank you.
I have another question from audience. O Ronaldo Sertan faz uma pergunta para o Respício. Fazer em inglês para eles entenderem, Respício? Pode ser? Ele mandou em inglês aqui. Mas eu vou juntar duas perguntas com a minha também, tá? How will the uncertainties of the future of aviation impact the present airport concession contracts in Brazil? In your opinion, what would be the best concession model for Brazilian airports? How about the participation of Infraero at Guarulhos and Galeão airports? The three questions, Okay, understand?
Okay. I'm totally against participation of Infraero in any airport consortium in Brazil.
So
since the beginning, I was totally against, and I'm still against. The other question is about the uncertainties regarding the business models and the concession itself. Probably this is a great opportunity for the Brazilian government to, first of all, not, how would I say it? My English is too rusty. Not to, Janar, me ajuda, encomendar.
Encomendar.
Request, prepare, request.
Yeah, to request.
Okay, request. Okay, request. The Brazilian government not request and or prepare any demand forecast studies for the airports, for the new concessions. Let the interested parties do their full research with all the data available. Do not try to predict anything, absolutely anything. This is a huge opportunity for the Brazilian government to put in the hands of the private and whatever international consortiums to do their own studies based on the data available. Do not request studies from firm A or firm B or whatever the Brazilian government has done this in the past, right? It releases a demand study and the consortiums, the winning consortiums say, oh, you said that the demand would peak 30%, but the demand is only 5%. So it's your fault that I gave this amount of money for this airport. So it's a huge opportunity for the Brazilian government not to do any kind of demand studies, demand projections for any new concessions. What's the third question, Quintela, please?
What's the best concession model you consider?
The best concession model is probably individual airports on the capitals, the state capitals, and group airports in the countryside, in the interior of Brazil. Probably I would go for this kind of model.
Okay. Mr. Rui, please. The last question, please, because time is running out.
No, if you allow me, so since we are very quiet in time, I just would like to add a comment. What we are seeing here. So, first of all, for decades, aviation needed to get confidence on the safety side. We need to prove the public since the 30s that aviation was safe to fly. So it's an endless issue, but we are substantially better in the world, particularly in Brazil, on this subject. We'll go second for security. Up to September 11, we thought that those problems were only located on conflict areas, and they were not. So today, the whole world, so you have a level of security in the inner land of Brazil that you did not imagine that you needed to have 30 years ago. And now what we are facing is a kind of sanitary risk mitigation, because if we thought that some problems could be kept in the inner land of China or in some exotic areas, the world is facing something very, very different now. So the sanitary risk mitigation now, in the same way of security risks and safety risks, need to be lowered on more or less the same way. Maybe to Khalid, a certain comment on that, if you may say something about, please, Khalid.
No, I think absolutely. The globalization is actually, and naturally the safety factor becomes important, how the virus propagation, and the world has to actually come together into fighting this pandemic. And I think, where everybody's racing towards a common goal of getting the vaccination out and getting it mass produced as well. I think that's where a lot of governments and a lot of entities will need to come together and, formulating a plan to come through, similar to what happened with the prior shock events, and how do you get the travelers back safely up in the air?
We have our time is running out, and I ask each panelist for a final 1-minute message. Okay, please, Mr. Richard.
Well, thank you very much for including me. Obrigado to everybody for coming. We've never seen numbers like this before. It's the worst crisis the industry has ever faced, but people want to fly. And because this is purely dependent upon the vaccine and getting through the pandemic, I'm very confident that when that happens, this industry will be back and the growth rates will be the strongest we've seen. However, we do face a very difficult couple of years ahead. Obrigado.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Call.
Thank you very much. No, it was a pleasure to actually, have a wonderful discussion with a lot of people on this great topic. And I think, again, what I would echo here is the sense of hope. Aviation industry has shown a lot of resilience in the past. It will go through some structural changes. I think that's very imminent. This is a time where companies will have to go through the blood, sweat, and tears of how do they reevaluate their business model, make some, tough choices. But at the back end of it, this is going to actually emerge as a very strong industry. People are going to be back traveling again. And it's all about interconnectedness of people and economies around the world. And that will come back.
Okay. Thank you. Mr. Rui.
Professor Quintela, first of all, thank you very much. It was really a pleasure, a honor to stay here with Richard, with Khalid. I know the people of Oliver Wyman in Brazil. We work a lot with them. Very high-level works. Professor Respicio, it's a pleasure to see you personally. Your name is already known in the aviation. So, Gernard, and it's really just to thank you very much. So we are working day and night to resume confidence of the passengers in flying and to help the companies to be back in the way we can, in the most optimized way. And I would like to suggest, eu queria sugerir ao professor Quintela, eu toco em português, queria sugerir ao professor Quintela que o próximo webinar desse tenha umas 4 horas, porque realmente nós temos uma profundidade de assuntos muito grande para discutir. Foi um grande prazer, agradeço demais. Estamos à disposição de vocês.
Desculpa para o nosso público, porque eu estou com muitas perguntas aqui, infelizmente não consegui passar. Peço desculpa, mas o tempo é uma situação, sempre tudo é limitado, né? Janás, o seu minuto final, depois o Respite, por favor.
Sure. No, as a matter of fact, I just would like to thank, first of all, for the speakers and the panelists to be joining us. It's a real pleasure to be part of the discussion. And I'm going to take a little bit of what Respicio said, and also, the hope that Richard has in terms of the recovery of the industry. As things move forward, we have noticed that, at least in Brazil, we see a very dynamic industry. Just to give you some background information, recently we have been spoken with 2 new airline companies that decided, to launch their operation in Brazil. One is the airline ITA, which has Rodrigo Vilaça, which is a colleague from Mr. Quintela, as the CEO. So we have a new airline company that's going to be launched in March 2021. And also we have a regional company that's being formed in Miami and going to operate out of the Brazilian capital, for regional flights. So I think that what Respicio was saying, companies going to try to reinvent themselves. And eventually now we see these aircrafts, that are available throughout the world, and we have courage investors, taking this opportunity, to launch new operations. So, I just would like to leave this as a signal that everything is possible. And we have, investors that want to take the risk to start new business. Thank you.
Respício, por favor, minuto final. Estamos em cima aqui já.
Thank you very much, Quintela. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you very much at the audience also via YouTube. I would say let us grab these opportunities, these immense opportunities that are lying ahead of us in terms of new business models, in new concepts, in new practices, in new procedures. And I would remember a motto from Southwest Airlines, and it goes not only for airlines, but for all economic activities throughout the world, hotels, restaurants, universities. But Southwest said back in the 70s, we are not a company of planes, we are a company of people. Let us remind this. All our businesses are made of people, human beings. Thank you very much.
Então, antes de encerrar, gostaria de comunicar que o nosso próximo webinar será no dia 29 de setembro, na próxima terça-feira, no mesmo horário, 16 horas. O tema será Tendências do setor portuário para o cenário pós-Covid-19. Eu e o Genar estamos aí nessa de novo, na terça-feira que vem. Agradeço mais uma vez a presença de nossos debatedores, nossos palestrantes. Thank you again, Mr. Richard Buflafia and Mr. Khaled Usman. Em nome da Fundação Getúlio Vargas, FGV In Company, FGV Transportes, Consulado Geral dos Estados Unidos, Amcham e Abdib, agradeço ao público presente, peço desculpa por não ter colocado todas as perguntas no ar e vejo vocês em nosso próximo webinário. Bye, bye. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Prazer te ver de novo, Respício, que eu não te vi há muito tempo.
Thank you.